Hey, what's up guys? I'm Evan, and today I'm going to be talking about a port of Expo which enables you to use all the best web features with your existing React Native apps. So first, as Brent said, I'm Evan Bacon. I'm an open source developer at Expo, and just like most software developers, I'm also a professional Lego master builder. I've been doing this since I was about 12 years old. Here's a video of me building a module for a long time. Questions I usually get asked are like, how long does it take you, which is like 100 hours, or how many bricks does it take, and like I usually don't count them. And then also like, I'm asked a lot if I'm a middle child, and I don't know if that means anything, so I'm just gonna like, I don't know. So, yeah, it's pretty much like open source. Another really interesting fact about me is that I'm considered to be a very opinionated developer. I don't know where this comes from. I have obviously no particular biases towards anything, as you can tell by this picture of me wearing the React logo. My favorite way to use React Native is with a framework called Expo, which I work on. Expo provides kind of all the modules that you need to build a practical application, things like camera, video, ARKit, maps. So it also has a client app which you download from the App Store, and then you can synchronize your build to that phone, and it's really great for prototyping and making cool stuff. So I started using Expo for my job. Before I came to Expo, I was a prototyper, and I kind of just used it in my spare time a lot. I kind of grew a liking to it, and I would clone things. Like I've got this Doodle Jump clone, and then I clone Crossy Road, and various other, obviously a Lego thing. And then I just kind of became really obsessed with it, and I would take it to bars and parties and dinner and everywhere, and I would just only write Expo code. And then I got really obsessed with it, and I made a video game about Brent Vatney and the other Expo developers, and my now boss, which he found it a little creepy, but I think he likes it. And they're like talking about defeating other cross-platform development frameworks which are not as good. And then, like any crippling addiction, I left my job to focus on it full-time. So now I work at Expo, and I absolutely love it. But there are a lot of problems with only doing native app development. I think like one of the biggest problems is that like apps don't have the same kind of adoption rate that websites have. You can send someone a link and they can open it. You don't have to download it. You don't need particularly a lot of storage on your phone. This is a conversation that I had with my little sister one day, and she tries not to hurt my feelings, but yeah. So my approach to this problem was to look at React Native for web. We actually met with the React Native team at Facebook to try and talk about how we could go about making React Native a first-tier platform along with iOS and Android, so that when you generate or when you work on a React Native app, web is just something that is a part of the whole process. And possibly, sorry, let me go back real quick. Never mind. So React Native for Web was made by Nick Gallagher to work on or to make the Twitter Lite PWA, which is possibly like one of the most notable PWAs around. Nick Gallagher also made normalized CSS, so he's very smart, much smarter than I am. And the way it works under the hood is it uses things like view and text and image, and then it binds those to like div and span and image element. So essentially what you're left with is just a regular website. Not a lot of crazy magic. I mean, yeah, there's lots of crazy magic. Never mind. I take that back. It also uses accessibility in a really interesting way, in the sense that if you were to, for instance, if you wanted an anchor element, you would set the accessibility role on a text element to link, and then it would become a link effectively. So it turns accessibility into a building block rather than kind of this feature that you add on top of it, and then that accessibility becomes universal and applies to iOS and Android. So pretty interesting stuff. It also has a style sheet library, and I'm going to quote this directly, the fastest, scalable, most powerful CSS and JS library ever. You can go to this benchmark test because it's a very hefty claim and see it kind of against other CSS and JS libraries where it is as fast or faster than a lot of other options, performing a lot of different tasks like mount tree and mount deep tree and things like that. And a lot of really cool companies are using React Native for Web. So like Major League Soccer, Flipkart, Uber, The Times. I'm going to read the last one there too. DataCamp. They all use React Native for Web in some capacity in their website, their PWA, their desktop PWA. So it's a very proven technology, and a lot of people seem to love it and really enjoy working with it. So we can go right from that into the problems with it. And there are a few, but they're not necessarily related to React Native for Web. These problems are specifically when you try to use React Native for Web and React Native at the same time to make a universal application. The first problem that I find is that it's hard to make a web app and a native app literally at the same time, like run them as the same process. The reason for this is that React Native uses the Metro bundler, whereas Create React App and a lot of the internet uses Webpack. So using two different bundlers can make it pretty tricky to run things the same way. So you can also run Metro in the browser, but we're just going to stick to React Native today. And I don't even know how to put this. So Webpack can be kind of hard to approach if you're a native developer. If you're coming from a background of just iOS or Android development, and you just want to make your app run on the web, it can be very tricky to get started, to get interested in all the config stuff, and taking a similar approach to Create React App, what I did to combat this was adding a custom Webpack config and then a dynamic Babel preset, which would transform your code differently on Metro than it would on React Native, and then finally rolling those all into the Expo CLI, so when you ran Expo Start, it would look kind of like this, except not with the cat. You could just update your text, and it will run in web and native at the same time. So effectively, you don't have any divergence, and you can, make important apps like this. The next problem, and this one was kind of a tricky problem to solve, is essentially the tree shaking was very fragile. Now, if you're not familiar with tree shaking, that is where you go through and you look for code that's not being used and remove it. And it didn't necessarily work with React Native for Web. I mean, it does work and works very well. But if you take an existing native app and you move it to web, and any of your code touches any of these libraries from React Native, or if any module that you import touches one of these, like almost every library does, then it immediately breaks tree shaking, and it's very hard to debug. So my solution to this was simply to, so here's what a bundle looks like when you have this issue. Effectively, you pull in every single module, even if you're not using it, and then you pull in all of React Art, which I've highlighted here because literally no one uses React Art. That's part of the whole opinionated thing. Cool. And the problem with this is a megabyte for a parsed bundle is just not very practical. I mean, that's almost as big as a Flutter web project. And the performance becomes really bad, and I'm really driven by Lighthouse scores. So my solution to this was to just drink a lot of Red Bull and upstream changes, which fixed every single one of those modules. I'll kind of break down what is going on at a more granular technical level. Essentially, if this was your whole app and you're just importing text and constants from a library like Expo, the problem that you're going to have is that it's going to import all of the code from that library. Now, the reason for this is because to be optimal for Metro, which is what people do when they make a React Native library, they use lazy requiring in a getter. And if you want to be optimal for Webpack, you need to use the ES modules import and export keywords, which will then effectively let your bundler know that it needs to remove that code. And so to solve this, I had to build the Babel thing, which goes through, and then it removes all the code by creating two separate entry points, one for native and one for web. And now the same block of code will run by only adding 2 kilobytes extra, so it's effectively much better because now you're only using the code that you want. And then my boss told me, do not show them this picture. So if you were to bootstrap a new project with Expo Web, and then upload it to a provider which serves with HTTPS. Then, I mean, there's a lot of nuance to this, but then depending on how Lighthouse is feeling, you can get hundreds across the board. I tried this right before I came up, and it was 98, so I was freaking out, but it's usually 100. It just kind of wavers, I guess, sometimes. It's very stressful. And then finally, the last big problem is probably, this is a problem that Expo tried to solve with React Native, and that is that there just weren't enough universal libraries to build things. Now, this problem is a little different on the web because you can always access web code. There's no sense of like needing native modules, but not having universal modules means that you can't build universal applications. So this is something I wanted to solve with Expo. And the way I like to do things is by cloning things. So I tried to clone Instagram, and that's Nick Gallagher, by the way, in the middle with the hearts and the stuff. So we're going to focus on just these screens. We've got the home screen, and then we've got the camera screen and the profile screen. And so if we dig into these and we look at the profile screen, right, all of this is primitive, so all of this is provided by React Native for web, and we can build this and it will be universal and it will be fine, which is great. But if we go to the camera screen, literally none of these APIs are universal, so every single one of these needs to be built manually by whoever is building their progressive or whatever, their universal application. And that's just a lot to do. So this first kind of grouping of libraries here, like SVG and Gradient, those are very easy to implement in the web. And for linear gradient, you could just use a style prop. But the problem is, if you do something like that, then you no longer get the ability to run it on iOS and Android as well. And I think it's those little minor details where it's super easy to just not do it, where people start to really diverge in their app from being universal to just being, I'll make a React app and a React Native app. I mean, that's pretty reasonable, but I'm very lazy. So this meant having a font loading library, which would enable you to load fonts without ever touching CSS, because you don't do that on iOS or Android, and having an image picker library, which enabled you to statically open an image picker without interacting with HTML. I can't believe I just forgot the word HTML for a second. And then finally, having something like the camera API, which will run in the browser using as many native functionalities as possible. So this one, you can change the autofocus and zoom in natively. Android actually has a lot of camera functions, which is really surprising. You can also turn the flash on. So lots of cool stuff. And once we combine these together, it creates something really interesting, which we'll get to here in a second. So this next grouping of libraries, things like the screenshot or view shot, blur views, and action sheets, those ones kind of don't have support or have partial support. So we have to do things like what we do on iOS and Android, where there's the iOS action sheet, but on Android, we just create one out of primitives. And then for blur views, blur view and the web is only supported in Safari, so we kind of have to fall back to a low opacity view, like what we do on low-end Android devices. So make compromises here and there to just try and give you the optimal module, I guess. And then finally, there's this last group, which is things like ARKit and Media Library, which have no parity to the web at all. And for these, we need to create a protocol of failing gracefully. And the way we do this is we can do feature detection, or we could check for permission and hide it behind a gate. So if you're on a device which doesn't have a camera, for instance, it might return unavailable as opposed to undetermined or denied or granted. And then finally, we could just throw errors, which is a really nice way to do it. It's very creative. What it will do is it will throw an error before running an asynchronous task. So you effectively can find out where it is, and you don't have this crazy stack trace that doesn't show you where the error is. And then when we combine these together, we get something like this. This is the Instagram camera, or at least my rendition of it, running in the web. You see we have a camera view, we have a blur view running on top of it. For whatever reason, the list view stutters because that apparently is more complex than running a camera view. And then there's animations, gradients, fonts, really everything. And I built this for native, and it runs in the web as expected. So it's really cool. And you can also try it at expogram.netlify. None of this is is a little beta, but you can try all of it, and it should work for you, maybe. I don't know. So if we go to the next big problem, that's navigation. Now, navigation controls a lot of your app, and navigation works very differently on web than it does on native. So We needed to do two things. The first one being that we needed it to just work. So if you took your existing app and you moved it into web, it would just run as you would expect. But then we also wanted to be able to give it the ability to optimize. So taking React Navigation, which is made by our illustrious MC, Brent Batney, we can take static navigation from native and run it in the browser like this. But you'll notice the history API doesn't change, and the back buttons don't work. You need to use the built-in one, or you need to use the custom ones. And stuff like this makes it less than optimal, but at least it still gives you the option to prototype in the browser. And then if we bring these back into our Instagram prototype, you'll see we can integrate the history API, the swiping. We also have things like the drawer navigator. So it's getting very close to being a pretty good clone. The last thing was a lot more difficult, the gestures and animation system. So using an experimental port of React Native gesture handler, I was able to get the actual pinch to zoom and drag around thing to work in the browser, but it's less than optimal and it works a lot less good than it would just natively. So still working on that, but I'm pretty sure it's probably just never going to be as good as native. And an example of this is with the cube transition right here. So if you look very carefully, you'll notice it lags a lot, and that is, it could be fixed, but I like this because it's a good example of you can build something on native and it might not run the same way in web because there's just a lot of core differences, especially when it comes to animations. So now that I have this framework for building, one second, I won't get ahead of myself. Now that I've got this framework for building all of these different features and functions in the web and running them universally on native, I can take and apply this to everything. So I did that. I took all of the apps that I made prior to coming to Expo, and I added web support to literally all of them. There's the Obsession one, and there's the Crossy Road one, and Doodle Jump, and Flappy Bird, and I'm sure a lot of these will get DMCA'd now that I've shown them. But after I ran out of my own apps to create, I then took the React Europe app, kind of just taking literally any app I could find and seeing if it would work with this new system. So this is going to pop open the QR code and scan it. And you can also try this yourself too, europe.netlify.com, and I'll show links to all these at the end. But essentially, you can run this exactly as it does in the native app in the browser. And then I thought, why stop there? Why not just also add progressive web app support, because it's basically 3 more things. And I don't really know about how everyone else generates PWAs, but I usually just Google it and find a new way to do it every single time. So I figured I would build this into the actual build step so that when you are done with your app, it immediately generates a new PWA manifest each time. And the result of this is you get a placeholder service worker, you get a manifest JSON, you get all the correct inputs in the head, and you can get a desktop PWA and all your websites run offline right out of the gate, which is very cool. It also takes all of your native information because you built your native app and your website with Expo, so it has all of the information to know what you want your app to look like, and then it adds very good parity by taking those app icons and converting them to all the correct sizes. Same with your splash screen, so you always get a loading screen in your PWA, and it never goes stale because every time you make a new build, it will regenerate all these things. And finally, I'm going to talk about the future plans. And there's really just one future plan, and that is to actually make it, fully stable. And I'm planning to do that within the next 1 to 2 weeks. So essentially, currently, it's very easy to push web updates. I don't know how many of you guys are native developers, but it's very difficult to push native updates because you need to go through the App Store and the Play Store. So once these have been approved in the App Store and Play Store, then you will be able to run iOS, Android, and web all at the same time with whatever Expo project you have or React Native project after you've added web support. And then more importantly than having a ton of modules, I found, is ensuring that they work. It's something that I kind of struggle with a lot. So to do that, I've used this awesome cool tool called Storybook. And what it does is it enables you to run all of your components in a visual thing like this, and you can do visual regression testing with it. Now, Storybook is already universal because it's a React app, and then the counterpart runs in React Native. So what I actually did was I just forked it and then made it all run with Expo to test Expo. So it runs fully cross-platform universal, testing universal components, and ensuring that they always run and never fail. And now that there is the ability to run all of this new native code in the browser, what I've done is I've just been going through and integrating native tools with all of the existing web tools, so stuff like Code Sandbox. I got this PR out, and then you'll be able to write and start writing your native projects in Code Sandbox, which is really cool. And then, yeah, that's Expo for Web. And if you want to follow any of these things, because there's a lot of changes, I have them all up on this website, native.directory, and you can see which platform things work and which ones do not work. So Expo Print, for instance, has full universal compatibility. And then, yeah, if you want to follow the project, you can follow Expo. Follow me at Bacon Bricks, but I'm usually more nervous on Twitter than I am in real life. And then all the code is on this monorepo, Expo, and the tools and the setup instructions are on web examples, and I'll put the slides up on Evan Bacon. And here is the links to all the projects that I just showed. It would be great if you guys could try them and let me know as soon as it breaks. In fact, just make a game out of it. If it breaks, tweet it at me. And be offensive with it too, I don't care. So, also enjoy them while they last, because they probably will be DMCA'd. And yeah, that's it.